Welcome to today's coffee hour interview with Dr. Aaron Franklin.
Professor Franklin received his Ph.D. from Purdue in 2008. He was a Ph.D. student at the Birck Nanotechnology Center while it was being built, and as a member of NSAC, he served as a tour guide for the first few weeks after the center's opening. Despite the challenges of transitioning lab equipment to Birck, he completed his direct Ph.D. in ECE in just 3.5 years. He then spent the next 6 years on the research staff at the IBM T.J. Watson Research Center in New York. In 2014, he joined the faculty at Duke University. Since coming to Duke, Professor Franklin's group has made transformative advancements in printed electronics, including the invention of sensors that have spurred the successful spin-out of a funded company, Tirad Incorporated. Professor Franklin has also published more than 90 peer-reviewed papers and holds more than 50 patents. Without further ado, I will now introduce Professor Aaron Franklin and our very own Yuhang Fang. Joy, I'll pass it on to you.
Thank you, Mauricio, for the introduction. Welcome back to Birck, Professor Franklin. So as mentioned by Mauricio, Professor Franklin, you really have many interesting achievements in your life. So I'm just out of curiosity, is being a scientist or inventor in your dream when you were a little child?
Thanks for that question, Joy, and for the introduction, Mauricio. I just want to say, first and foremost, it's a real pleasure to participate in this series. I was telling the organizers before it started how impressed I am with this idea of bringing alumni and current faculty together and being able to provide some platform for learning from folks that have been engaged with work at Purdue. And I'm really honored to have been asked to participate. So happy to talk about anything you're interested in. Regarding my interests and how I sort of ended up having my career focus on engineering and science, when I was a kid, probably around 11, 12 years old, grew up in inner city Phoenix, Arizona. And I didn't have any history of college participation from my family on either side. And I loved things that were science related, but didn't really have a lot of examples of what I would do with any type of education in science. So a couple of engineers from Motorola visited my classroom when I was maybe in 7th or 8th grade and gave a presentation about working in a clean room. They came in, one of them had a clean room suit on, and they talked about what they did, and they were electrical engineers, and it sounded so impressive to me. And everyone, I looked around the classroom, I remember thinking, everyone's really impressed with these people. And right then I decided I want to be an electrical engineer. That was it. It was totally naive. It was not necessarily built out of known aptitude or interest. It was purely a matter of that sitting in that classroom and seeing something that really seemed important and exciting. And thankfully, and that's why I sort of mentioned in this brief title that you guys used for the talk about accidentally finding the career that I love, as my life progressed from there through the rest of high school and into the experience I had in undergrad, there was refinement to where my interests were, but they remained centered in electrical engineering. So the more I learned about the field, the more about options for how to work in the field, that it further kind of chiseled away at that rough initial, block of wood, if you will, of an idea that I wanted to generally be an electrical engineer. And thanks to a lot of great mentors and other experiences, it eventually led me to arrive at the position I'm in now as a professor, which I really love. And so I'm sort of telling the end at the beginning here, but really along the way of all the experience I've had through my education and my life, it has been a continuous sort of sculpting of doing the things that I ended up enjoying. So it took me a lot of trying things I did not end up enjoying to get there. And that was spending a year at Intel, which I loved the company, but did not love my job between my undergrad and PhD, to spending time at IBM, which I actually loved very much, but never intended to stay as long as I did, until eventually I wound up back in academia. So there's a lot of reasons why I rattled around like a pinball to end up at that place, but I'm really thrilled with how it's all come together.
Yeah, so you start doing science because you feel it's cool, not because some big idea. Yeah, that's good to know. I think you kind of give an overview of your whole journey, and we will walk through that story like just step by step. I'm just out of curiosity, if you're not doing science or science related, what was in your mind when you're thinking about future when you were young?
Yeah, thanks for that question. As a teenager, growing up, the life I grew up in, I lived in a single parent home. We didn't have a lot of financial means. I worked a lot, and very little of it was technical or science related. I did a lot of construction work, and I honestly saw my future being one that was doing construction type jobs, and that was really okay with me. I mean, that's very much where I had my sights set. And so when I had a variety of other things I did as a teenager, but when I did go to my undergrad. I started at the University of Arizona and in electrical engineering because I still thought that's what I wanted to do, but I actually failed out of my undergrad at University of Arizona. There's a lot of excuses I could give, but I had a scholarship there, and it was totally wasted in that first year because I did so poorly in my classes. And at that point, the high school I'd gone to, which I loved, but it was a challenging school environment, not a lot of academic drive amongst the broad student body. So it wasn't super difficult to do well enough to get a scholarship out of it. And I stayed in state and went to the U of A, and basically was surprised when I started failing exams, and professors would say, come to my office hours. And to me, I thought, what's an office hour? I've got like 4 or 5 classes. I can't come to an office hour. And I mean, it just made no sense to me. It was completely foreign to me how to properly study and apply myself. And so by the end of my year that I spent there, I had a GPA of 0.96. And I remember it to this day. And I left there and I decided I was never going back to school again. It wasn't for me. That people telling me whether I knew something or not, it was just not something I tended to enjoy. So I left school and I decided I was going to do construction for the rest of my life. So I was 18, 19 years old, and started a little business painting houses and apartments. Ended up taking a sidestep from that even, and spent 2 years actually as a full-time missionary for my church. And when I came back from my mission, I had a renewed energy. I learned things about myself. I was 21 at that point, and I decided to get back at school. Like maybe I could actually do this. And I couldn't get back into a university because it filled out. So I went to community college for 2 years. Then I transferred to Arizona State University, and things were totally different. The perspective. I guess the main point I'm making of that, to build off of your question, is that if there's anything I have to offer people in life, and a lot of the folks in this are already very accomplished, so I don't know that they have as much need for what I would say from my experience, my part of my experience there. But it's amazing how much perspective can transform what you're capable of. And for me, if you talked to me when I was 19 years old, I'd say I'm completely incapable of succeeding in academics. What I had been handed at that point, and the way that it had come to pass for me, I thought there was no way I could do it. And nothing about me changed in terms of my aptitude in the 2 or so years between when I stopped going to school at the University of Arizona and when I went back to community college, other than my attitude and my perspective about the whole thing. And so when I finished my undergrad from ASU and I got a 4.0 GPA, to contrast my 0.96 GPA, both of those GPAs I felt I had truly earned based on my capabilities. And so the only difference was really a matter of that kind of perspective and applying myself. So it's a long answer, Joy, to your question, and maybe a little bit more ended.
But this is such an amazing answer. I never thought the story will be like this. So you think it's only the attitude that changed, but I still feel like theoretically, it will be harder after several years out of school to going back and work hard and get 4.0. So it is amazing. And I just noticed that you also got a minor in communication when you were doing your bachelor. How does this happen?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that. So when I was actually applying for my graduation at Arizona State, and I have to sit down with like one of the university administrator folks that makes sure that you actually got all the right credits. And the woman that I sat down to do that with, she said, "Wow, I've been here for 10 years. I don't think I've ever seen an engineering student get a minor in communication before." And so I'd broken some kind of a personally held record for her. And the reason for that is that one thing I learned about myself in the time when I was not in school and when I decided to come back is that I really enjoyed communicating. I really enjoyed engaging with people and in various environments, whether public speaking or even more interpersonal communications. And I wanted to do something with that. So I still had this sort of core drive to be that Motorola electrical engineer that I had seen when I was 12. It still was a big piece of my vision, but I wanted to find a way to bring in some of the unique interests I have into that field. And the older I got, the more I realized what we all have a realization of about the stereotypes of engineers, the sort of Dilbert comic like stereotypes, which are the antisocial, not really engaging, interactive people that engineers often get labeled as. And I wanted badly to defy that perception. And so for me, getting a minor in communications was one of the ways that I thought I could kind of make a showing for something a little different than the norm of what people think about when they think about engineers. So that's what really motivated me to do that. And in my career since then, by the way, there's times when I really haven't felt like I've drawn very deeply from that personal interest, and there's times when I draw very deeply from it, and that's part of the reason why when I eventually found myself back in academia as a professor, I feel like I get the ability to draw from that interest and skill set more so than any other part of my career that I have been in. So that's been a fun thing to grow.
Yeah. So out of that period of training in communication, like I believe you will get some like tricks or skills that how to make communication better. But is there any core inside communication that you really learn by experience?
Wow, that's a great question. So, with communication, the practice is ultimately what's going to win out with the greatest effect for becoming a more effective communicator. So there's no replacement for practice, and that goes with improving interpersonal communication as well as larger communication settings like giving talks at conferences and whatnot. And I'd say in addition to that, if there's a sort of internal side to the skill, I mean, the skill of practicing something so you can become better at it, there are books and books on how you can do that. But the one internal skill that I often apply to many aspects, including when it comes to communication, which is that you actually need to care about the message and the audience that you're delivering it to. So it's pretty easy to tell if someone cares about what they're talking about and what sort of vested interest there is there. And in fact, on a little bit of a tangent with that, I once had a colleague of mine come to me years ago. I was still at IBM, and I had some teaching experience at that point. So maybe this is a funny side story to tell. When I was at Purdue, I was really lucky to get a National Science Foundation Graduate Research Fellowship to support my PhD studies. And so I was on this fellowship while I was there, and I wanted desperately to be able to teach, like as a TA. And if things are still the way they were back then, the only students that we're teaching as TAs were students that required the funding that comes from being a TA. So that was sort of a support mechanism if you didn't have a research assistantship or a fellowship. And so I tried to buck the trend. I went to the mathematics department where I knew engineering students were teaching Calc 1 classes and such. And I said, can I please teach a Calc 1 section? I'll do it for free. I'll do it for free. You don't have to pay me. I mean, it wasn't even so much a love of the material per se. It was really out of a sincere interest to gain some teaching experience and how much I wanted to grow in that area. And they wouldn't do it. No one would take me. And so I actually, during that 3.5-year stint that I was at Purdue, the last year to year and a half, I was an adjunct faculty at Ivy Tech Community College, which is in Lafayette. And I taught an introduction to algebra class. So it was a night class for folks in the area who were like returning to school, which of course were near and dear to my heart, because having left school and never to return when I was 19, only to come back and be at a community college to get my education started again, I had deep, really sincere care for these people who came and were coming back to school. And so I did that for a little over a year. I taught this night class on Intro to Algebra at Ivy Tech Community College while I was a PhD student at Purdue. And that was sort of a really nice stepping stone for me, so that years later, 4 years, 5 years later, while I was at IBM, that I was able to start teaching as an adjunct at Columbia University, where I'd met some folks through collaborations and such as an IBM researcher. And that sort of ended up being the catalyst to the opportunities that developed for me in academia.
So I think you mentioned that you feel the desire of learning so that you come back to college. And because of some people working in clean room kind of like get your desire of science, so you think maybe doing science is a good way. So is that the whole story? When do you feel like you have the sense of doing science?
Yeah, I think maybe an added piece to the story that can give a little more perspective to why or when I got the sense that I really wanted to be in the more scientific field for my career probably comes out of when I was a component design engineer at Intel. So when I finished my undergrad at Arizona State, I got a job. It was lined up months before I graduated, and you could not be more excited than I was to go and work at Intel. I felt like I had reached that pinnacle, right? That initial goal of being an engineer, an electrical engineer, from the Motorola example that I had as a kid. And so when I got that job, and I loved Intel, I mean, it remains obviously a significant industry leader in the semiconductor space. At the time, they were the indisputable leader, where you didn't have the same type of competition that you see from foundry-like fabs like TSMC at the time. So Intel was the place to be, and I didn't have a clue what I was going to do there. I just knew they hired me, and I was going to be involved in some design for chips, and that sounded perfect to me. And so my vision of my future at that point had almost nothing to do with scientific work. I had done a summer research internship at Purdue when I was between my junior, senior year of my undergrad. And so I'd gotten a taste, and I knew I enjoyed it, but it wasn't enough to where I was convinced that was absolutely where I was going to go. And so it really wasn't until the first couple of weeks at Intel that a lot of my perspective about where I wanted to be in my career changed. And first of all, loved the company even after being there. Loved the people that I worked with there. It was really great. I could have stayed there and been happy the rest of my career. It's often said you either need to love what you do or you need to love who you work with. And that, you got to have one of them. And if you can have both, that's great. That's nirvana. That's what everyone should really be aiming for. But for me, when I was at Intel, it was so clear early on that I only had one of the two, which is I loved those people. I loved the place. I could not stand what I did for work, which was I was in a cubicle, and people who don't know Intel maybe not realize that there are no offices. It's a company mantra. So there are only cubicles. The CEO, cubicle, a big cubicle, but still a cubicle. So it's just a sea of cubicles in every floor of every building of Intel. And mine was, one of those, and you know where you are based on the labels on the pillars in the building. Like there's a little number on the pillar. Okay, that's how I can find myself. And I realized, sitting in a cubicle, that they gave me a bunch of tasks to do, and it was completely foreign. I mean, it was so built on internal jargon and specifically developed internal processes. I felt like nothing I had learned in my undergrad mattered. Like they only wanted someone who actually learned to be an engineer, and they were going to tell me everything I needed to do there. And most of the people I worked with there were so fine with that. Because of loving the place and coming to be good, they got better and better at what they did. But for me, within a few weeks, I thought, I cannot do this. I cannot do this. And the part of me that, I still had this little part of me that thought, well, maybe I could lead the company. Maybe I'll become a manager and then a senior manager. And then, and that would give me the fulfillment that I want in other areas. But my boss, my manager, who had been at Intel for 15 years, she was incredibly brilliant. She had an MBA on top of her bachelor's degree in engineering. She had an MBA from Carnegie Mellon, and she was managing 5 people doing the exact same thing every day that they were trying to teach me to do. And I looked at that and I thought, I'll never make it. I'll never make it. I can't do this for 15 years only to be at that place. And that's when, again, within a few weeks, I realized I want to get back into science. I want to pursue the engineering field from more of a scientific perch by pursuing my PhD. And that's when I started applying and ended up back at Purdue, where I had done that summer internship. Maybe it's a good time, Mauricio, for me to show and tell what I brought from my Birck days. So when in the bio, it mentioned that I was there when Birck was being built. And since I know this is the Nanotechnology Student Advisory Council, I thought you'd appreciate some memorabilia in case you haven't seen it in offices of faculty and such there at Birck. I have this name tag, and I don't know how big my video is, or if it's backwards. It looks backwards.
No, I see it. Yeah, there it is.
Okay, so I don't know if they make these anymore, but you can see Nanotechnology Student Advisory Council and Birck. Yeah, they gave us these to when we were tour guides for the opening of Birck. And when they did the opening, when they set up a huge tent out in front. Now, I don't know what's out in front of that thing now, because there used to be like all they called them the barracks. They were the grad student housings that were all to, I think, the west of where Birck is. I think they've leveled all that now. So I don't know what's around it now. But back then, there were pretty open green spaces around where Birck was. So they set this huge tent up, and that's where they had the opening ceremony. And those of us who were the tour guides got to come to this. So the university president was there, provost, all the who's who, and then a sprinkling of a few of us graduate students who were going to be the tour guides. And at that event, it was a breakfast event. I don't know why it was held. I think it was held like on a Saturday or something. But it is in the morning, and they had orange juice that they served at the event, and they served it in beakers.
No way, in beakers. That is awesome. Even
so there's a label, Birck Nanotechnology Center dedication, October 8, 2005, and we drink. And I got to tell you, I thought it was super fun and probably extremely irresponsible, because we were drinking out of beakers. I mean, that's the last thing you want people to feel comfortable doing, right? But anyway, it's been cool to keep. And the last fun little walk down memory lane is I have kept
the Birck ID card.
Yeah. Do they look like this anymore?
In 2019, they switched the design a little bit. When I first came in 2018, that's exactly how my ID looked like.
Obviously, I look exactly the same. I mean, haven't aged a day. It's like it was yesterday.
Wow, thank you for sharing that.
Great to see you reserved them.
Yeah, I saved them. It's you should save your memorabilia too. You never know when you'll be invited back for a coffee hour.
I see. All right, nice to hear your story about Birck. I think you just mentioned that it's your experience in Intel that really drive you back to a PhD in Purdue? How do you make the decision of what topics you're going to work on?
Yeah. So great follow-on question. The summer that I'd spent at Purdue as a research intern was in Tim Fisher's lab. And he recently, I guess a few years ago, left Purdue. He's now the department chair of mechanical engineering at UCLA. And when he was obviously still at Purdue back then, when I did my summer internship, he was still relatively new there. And I worked on the synthesis of carbon nanotubes in his lab. Even as an electrical engineer undergrad, in him being a mechanical engineer, the overlap once you get into nanoscience and nanomaterials is pretty heavy between fields. So it was plenty natural for me to have spent the summer in his lab. And he was very generous with his recruitment invitations for me to consider coming back to Purdue, even though I wasn't even in his field. In fact, I credit Tim really heavily for his influence, his willingness to influence me, even though I was not building up his traditional repertoire, right? I wasn't in mechanical engineering. I wasn't part of the core space that he had built and was building his career. And yet I never felt like he was dismissive of me in spite of that. So I'm very grateful for his mentorship. And he was recruiting me to come back. I still wanted to be in electrical engineering. And so I applied to electrical engineering, and he said he was willing to basically kind of co-advise me. And so I was in an odd situation at Purdue. This is getting a little ahead of answering that question, but I often tell people I was sort of tri-advised. So my primary advisor in ECE was David James, who's still there. But the project I was working on was really funded through Tim Fisher's lab. And so I served really heavily under Tim's group. And then it was connected to Tim Sands' lab. Tim Sands, who became the Birck Nanotechnology Center director while I was still there in my PhD. And then for those of you who happen to know who Tim Sands is, he went on into a kind of unprecedented administrative track, became the provost, then the president of Purdue. I'm sorry, the provost of Purdue, and then the president of Virginia Tech, where he's now the president of Virginia Tech. So I had weekly meetings as a PhD student with these three luminaries. I don't know that I totally appreciated that at the time, but they were all three in my weekly meetings almost every week. And it's just serious credit to them for investing the time and energy they did into my work when I was a PhD student. But how I decided to come to Purdue, I obviously the connection that I had there was an attraction, and I only applied a couple other places. One of them was Stanford. I got into Stanford, but I felt like Stanford couldn't care less whether I were to come there or not. I felt like they were kind of, hey, you're in if you want to come, but it's up to you. And nevertheless, I was, as many people are, unfortunately, very wooed by rankings and thought Stanford's, it's number 2. It's the best. I should go to Stanford. And I was leaning that way until I contacted them and asked if I could visit the campus with one of their recruitment days, because Purdue had flown me back out. Yeah, put really the red carpet out. Lots of really generous ways of trying to recruit me. Whereas Stanford, I had only heard from them with my acceptance letter, no funding, no other things. And so when I reached out to them, I said, "Are you having a recruitment day? I can pay for my travel. I work at Intel. They have a campus nearby. They'll fly me out there." And the woman on the phone, she said, "What's your name?" And I tell her my name, and she said, "Hold on a second." Put it on hold, and then there's some papers shuffling, and then she comes back and says, "We don't have a visit day for you. So if you want, you can come to campus." And she gave me a date. She said, "We're having a poster session that afternoon, and you can come to the poster session." And to me, I was so naive. I thought, oh, okay, no big deal. Like, they don't have a visit day, but there's a poster session. Perfect. So I planned this whole trip where I go out and I visited this Intel campus nearby. So my trip was paid for. I show up to Stanford campus early. I'm on the phone with my wife. I was married during my undergrad. I got married. So I'm on the phone with my wife, and I'm telling her, this is great. I can already see myself at Stanford. This campus is beautiful. This is a done deal. And I'm talking to her, and I walk over to the electrical engineering building, and there's this big poster board out front that says PhD recruitment schedule. And it has a full 2 days of activities that were going on, with the last of the activities being this poster session that was held in the open space of their electrical engineering building. And when I saw that, and I realized that even though I had proactively reached out to them, I was paying my own way. I just wanted to feel like I was being included in some way there. The fact that they were unwilling to wrap me in, I felt so wounded. You know, my pride, all of that motivation and pride was flushed. And I hate admitting, it's a hard story for me to tell because I hate to admit that about myself, but I think I learned some valuable lessons about life from that experience that I think are worth translating into other people's lives, which is, when I decided at that point I was going to go to Purdue, I was making a decision because I was wounded. I had pride that was kind of checked. But the reality is, if I had been a little bit more open to the implications of my choice, I would have considered the significant advantages that were offered to me that mattered way more than the ranking of the school. What I was offered at Purdue, it could have been the 30th ranked school in engineering, not the 12th or 14th that it was at the time. And it still would have been a better choice, because what ultimately allows you to succeed in your undergrad has a lot less to do with the ranking of the school that you attend. There's a lot more to do with who you work with and the type of success you have in the work that you do. So end of that story really quickly is, at all of that experience, I did not know I had won a National Science Foundation Graduate Research Fellowship. And so it wasn't until after, it was a couple days after that whole thing, and I was like, okay, I'm going to Purdue, that I received word that I was getting this fellowship. And I mean, I was so surprised. It was such an honor to get that fellowship. And the first phone call I got, I was sitting in my cubicle at Intel, and the first phone call I got, answered the phone, and it was the director of graduate studies, my role now here at Duke, from Stanford. And it was the professor there. He called and he said, I just want to congratulate you on your National Science Foundation Fellowship. And I want to see if you have any questions about how to use your fellowship here at Stanford. And I said back to him, I said, I don't have any questions because I'm going to use my fellowship at Purdue. And he was so surprised by this, and I didn't want to be rude, but I did want to be honest. So he said, well, you know, why? Do you mind me asking why? So I told him everything I just told you. I told him the whole story, and he was very quiet at the end, and he said, I have a lot of excuses about our budget constraints, about all these things, but I know they're not going to make a difference. So good luck to you at Purdue. So anyway, there's a long answer to me being in science and how that all came about.
I see.
Purdue. I guess the question was about Purdue.
Yeah, but it turns out good, right? You feel Purdue cares about you and they're willing to support you to success. That's very important. I mean, you did achieve a lot in Purdue. You finished your PhD in 3.5 years. That's really a short PhD. How did that happen?
Luck, in a lot of ways, luck, and a lot of probably very annoying perseverance when it comes. And I say annoying because I think my advisors had to have been annoyed with me, because I was not an easy person to have to manage, because I was just so built with anxiety to get things done. And a couple things happened to me in my PhD at Purdue. One thing is I developed a bit of a life perspective about balancing work and personal life. So I mentioned I was married in my undergrad. When I came to Purdue, I had my first child. So my daughter, she had been born about 6 months before I started my PhD. So we moved to Purdue, We bought a house in Lafayette, 18th Street in Kossuth area. We loved that house. It was such a magical time for us as a family. And in the course of my PhD, we had my second child while I was there. And so, my family was growing. It was a lot of responsibility at home. And most people would look at that and think, oh, you could never get a whole lot of work done. You've got so much to focus on in personal life. But the actual reality tends to be the opposite in my experience, that having a healthy work-life balance where you're plenty motivated and dedicated to your work, but you balance that with what you have for obligations in your personal life, actually tends to be a more overall productive experience. It doesn't mean you work more hours. You can't possibly. Everyone only has 24 hours a day. So the fact that I was home every night by dinner time, 5 o'clock or so, the entire time of my PhD, and I only once went to campus on a weekend. I was never there on Saturday or Sunday. It was only there Monday through Friday. The fact that I achieved that was not because I didn't work very many hours. It's because I went to campus at 4:30 a.m. most days. And so I was the first one at Birck, except for the cleaning folks that were already the facility maintenance and management folks who were there. And in fact, when they had the big earthquake in Indiana, it was in Missouri, I think, but it was huge around the area, and aftershocks felt massively in the whole region in Indiana. I was at Birck. It was like 5 a.m. And I was there, and the building, building glass kind of creaked, and there's a whole experience. It shook awake my wife at home, and she called the office, my office at Birck, number, and what happened? Did you feel that? So anyway, early morning. That's what led me to experience that live at Birck. But the reality, back to the point about 3.5 years, is that I think having that balance mattered. And I've always been a bit of an aggressive, get things done kind of person, and so that certainly helped me get success pretty early. The other thing is I came back and started working on a project that built on what I did in the summer there. So I hit the ground running in a lot of ways, and that helped make rapid progress. So by the time I was in the summer of I'd been there for 3 years at Purdue. And Duke comes into the picture because I came to Duke that summer to teach, again, coming out of my passion for teaching, to teach a summer program course to high school students about nanotechnology. And it's a totally illogical way to spend your summer as a PhD student, right? I mean, as a PhD student, summer is like the golden time. That's when you actually get work done unencumbered. That's you don't compromise that. But to me, and to my advisors, their generosity to me of allowing me to do these things, I thought I want to teach more. And so I came to Duke. I'd never been here before, and I taught this summer program course. And while I was here in the summer, I ended up going to a conference and meeting up with some folks who were at IBM, and they were growing their research program around nanoscale carbon. And they were kind enough to aggressively recruit me. And I ended up interviewing there, and they basically said at the end of that summer, hey, we want you to come here, but you have to come by December. You have to start the position by the end of this year. And I thought, there's no way. I've only been at Purdue for 3 years, and for crying out loud, I haven't even been there all summer. I've been away, and so I was like, I don't even know if that's allowed. I don't have a master's degree. I don't even know if that's allowed. I still have a course to take. I still had one class to take. And I took it that last semester from Mark Lundstrom in my last semester there. But anyway, I started making phone calls. I talked to my advisors, and my advisors weren't happy about it. They were not happy about it, but they acknowledged that I had accomplished enough work to where if I could get my dissertation written, they would support it. And so I really, it's, when people ask me, how'd you do that? How'd you get a degree so fast? There's no formula for it, really. There's just a lot of things that you can't really control accidentally happening. And if you're working hard enough and you're focused on the right things, then sometimes they happen to come together. And that's kind of what happened there.
I see. I think that explains why you transitioned to IBM after Purdue. But I believe that when you were in Purdue, you actually haven't think about being a faculty in the future. So you came to IBM, and then you realize maybe working in just research is not the whole picture. So what did you think back then?
Yeah, back then, when I went to IBM, it was in my mind for 1 year maximum. That I was so honored to go to such a storied and historic institution. You know, IBM T.J. Watson Research Center is such a powerhouse for research advancements in my area. Jörg Appenzeller had just joined Purdue a year or so before from there, and I deeply admired the work that he had done and was doing. And so it was a huge honor for me to go there. But I knew I wanted at that point to be in academia. I knew that I wanted to be a professor. And so I saw IBM as a stepping stone, that I would go there, it would help me grow my network and open opportunities for faculty jobs. And it did all of those things. It just didn't do any of them the way that I had thought it would. So if I had sketched out my plan in 2008 when I finished my PhD and said, here's the plan, 1 year at IBM, huge success, make lots of connections, faculty job offers coming out my ears, and I choose the best place and the rest is history. That's what the story would have looked like. But instead, it was 2008 and the economy ended up collapsing over the next couple of years, and the job market was really dismal, and so any hope of getting anywhere else was gone, and I was grateful for my job. So I hunkered down, and I always had some nervous energy about me at IBM, but I loved the people I worked with there. I loved the traditional IBM research spirit that still existed there. It's there to some degree now, but it's largely been compromised by a shift towards externally funded research activities like quantum computing and such. But it's still a place of great people that does great work. And I did. By the time I'd never been there for 4 years, I thought, oh my gosh, I don't know if I'm ever going to get out of this place. And that's when I started teaching at Columbia, and I started thinking to myself, I could do this. I could work at IBM and teach at Columbia and be totally happy. And maybe that's what I'll do the rest of my career. And that was when folks started approaching me from Columbia at first and encouraged me to apply for a tenure track faculty position. And that kind of opened up that avenue that led me here to Duke. That was 7 years ago now.
Then why Duke?
Yeah, Duke, I had spent that summer here that I mentioned, and so that's the only reason it was on my map. Across my years at IBM, I collaborated with folks from all over the country, and none of them were from Duke. So I had zero connections that down here, which is a bad place to start if you're looking for a faculty position at a place. Excuse me, but I ended up reaching out to some people, because I wanted to at least look at another option outside of Columbia. I liked Columbia a lot, and to this day, there's a pain in my heart over what might have been if I'd gone to Columbia, because I would have been able to work with some terrific people. But ultimately, I knew I loved Duke. It had a similar feel to it in size and capabilities to Columbia. And I wanted to give another place a consideration. So I reached out to some folks here, and they were so responsive and so accommodating. And I came down to campus here, and I loved the facilities. It's not a 25,000 square foot Birck Nanotechnology Center clean room. It used to be 25,000 square feet. I think they've trimmed it down since then and took some space and made it non-clean, or not as clean, for the sake of cost. But the clean room here is small but functional. The capabilities are limited but sufficient, and the environment is so richly collaborative and so easy to navigate across disciplines that it became so attractive to me when I was looking into it. And I have never regretted that. In fact, my advice to you students when you're interviewing for jobs, whether they're academic jobs or otherwise, you make sure when you interview with people, you ask them. I've interviewed a lot of people in my career, both in industry and academia, and I get concerned when someone does not have questions about what it's like to be there as a longer term employee. So when I interviewed at Columbia and at Duke, I would ask every person, how come you're still here? But people move around a lot. Why are you staying here? You know, are you staying here? And what is it that keeps you here? And it's telling what people will say back. And one thing that was notable about the answers I got at Duke is that everyone, as if they were reading from a script, everyone said, I love it at Duke. It is a great place to be. I feel well taken care of. I like the area. And when you hear enough of that, it just gets into your bones. You're like, wow, if I don't go there, I'm clearly missing out on something that is available that I would really really enjoy.
I see. Then you really became our faculty, and then you need to run your own lab. So a lab needs a lot of fancy ideas to achieve them. Based on your achievement, we can tell you never run out of fancy ideas. So how do those fancy ideas build up?
That's a really good question. You may not run out of fancy ideas, but you could run out of funding for them. So there's two steps to that particular dynamic of being a faculty member. To this day, and I've gotten a reasonable amount of funding as a professor, I feel like the best ideas I've had never got funded. And I don't know if that's true of most faculty members, but it's amazing what ends up happening in your actual funded work versus where your mind goes. But yeah, I definitely don't run out of ideas. In fact, one of the reasons I wanted to be a faculty member is when I was at IBM, I didn't love, and even at Purdue, I did not love doing the lab work. I'm an experimentalist. I'm in the lab, building things, testing things, characterizing. And I was in the clean room. Tim Fisher would clout the rest of his time at Purdue that I racked up a bigger bill in the Birck clean room than anyone he knew of in history. It was something like $75,000 or $80,000 in a year, in 1 year, that I racked up in charges there. I'm sure someone's broken the record since then, but I was so heavily engaged in lab work. And honestly, I was good at it. I mean, I'm not good at everything. That's something I just was good at. And I'm pretty efficient in the work that I would do, but I didn't love it. Like I knew even as I did it, and especially at IBM, because you've got folks across their career still going and standing in front of an acid hood, right? I mean, doing a wet etch. And you're like, whoa, I don't want to be 60 years old standing in front of a wet hood. I mean, that's not what I want to do. And so some people love that. But for me, I was much more interested in seeing what happened when an experiment was run and then saying, oh, go try this, and this, and let me know how that goes. And I longed for that to be the place where I was. And so that's one of the things I love about being a professor is having that sort of view. I mean, my students are incredible students, and I continue to be so impressed with them and the work they do. And I just get to sit back, spout out some half good, half crazy, and not useful ideas, and they go off and work magic with it. And it's a really good vantage point to be in. I enjoy that part of it a lot. So one quick story on this point, and then I'll let you decide what you want to talk about if in the remaining time or questions, is that sometimes the best ideas are not necessarily ones that you spend years cooking up. When I had first gotten to Duke, I'd been here for maybe 6 months, and they contacted me, our Office of Industry Affairs contacted me, said, hey, we've got a couple folks. They want to invest in some research. It's private money, and will you come to a meeting with like 5 other faculty and just talk with them? And so this does not happen very often. Okay, so I'm like, okay, sure, fine. New professor, I need money. So I go to this meeting, and these 2 folks, they say, hey, we've got a little bit of money, and we want to make smart tires. We want car tires to be smart. We want sensors. We want data, whatever it takes. And so to that point, I loved cars, and I knew absolutely nothing about tires. But I'm sitting in this room with other professors, and we're all kind of like spitballing ideas. Oh, hey, I could do this, or hey, my lab does that. And it comes to my turn, and I was like, hey, I do printed electronics with nanomaterials. That sounds very cool because it is. And these materials have tremendous capacity to perform in different environments, electrically, mechanically, and so forth. I am confident I could integrate nanomaterials into a sensor that gives you data that you can't currently access in tires. And that was it. That was like my whole proposal was built out of the main motivation of my lab. And they kind of like sat back and they're like, we like that idea. And so I wrote them a few page little white paper, and they funded the lab. It was a decent amount of funding, is a few $100,000 for a couple of years. And it was to make these tire sensors. And that crazy comment and initial ideas that we came up with were some that happened to actually work. 99% of the time, ideas fresh out of the gate do not work how you anticipate. But that was one of them that actually did, and we patented that, and that's what ended up leading to Tyrata. It's a multi-million-dollar startup company now, still trying to make its way in terms of long-term sustainability, but it's been going well, and we've been operating it for a few years at this point.
Yeah, you mentioned your startup. I just realized for your all the stories here is just happen incidentally. You get prepared and the opportunities come, and then things were done. Yeah, I think we're approaching the end. I would like to encourage audience to ask some questions in the chat. So while we are waiting for more questions, because the time is limited, so let me try to ask the last several questions. So like you achieve a lot in the past dozens of years. It seems like it's an amazing life path. So what do you think the characteristic in you is, like the little seed that like finally grow up to be a prosperous tree like you are having now?
Yeah, thanks, Joy. I really love how you worded that question. This analogy of a seed and growing up, and I'm honored that you look at my life and say that you see so many of these accomplishments, because it really does feel like it's been something that's grown in the way that a seed grows. Which, I mean, if you think about how a seed grows, it's because of nutrients that come into the seed from its environment. If you didn't have those nutrients in the soil, if you didn't have the sunlight and the water to nourish and provide that needed supply of energy to grow, the seed would never grow. And that is the way that I look back and see my career. Anything that maybe is seen as an accomplishment or good, I absolutely recognize that it was not because of me, the seed or the root or the tree. It was all of the nutrients coming in, the mentors that I had, the advisors I had. I think back I was just talking in the beginning of this with Mauricio about, he asked if I knew David Go, who sat next to me in my office at Birck. We were office mates that we were great friends there. And folks like him and Baracola, who was there at the time, and Matt Moshman, who was there just a little before, and all of these people scattered throughout my life from when I was at Intel and undergrad and onward. Those people provided the type of nutrients that allowed the growth and success that I can lay claim to. And I would translate that to some advice for all of you. I mean, never be ignorant to the value you're getting out of the people around you. Be gracious about it. Some of the people that I loved working with the most at Birck were the lab staff. Dave Lebowski. I don't even know if Dave is still there or not, but we're working closely with folks like Dave and all the other folks that worked in the clean room space. That was a hallmark. I cherished that side of my PhD. And a lot of other students, they just walk right through. They don't even know their names. They don't even know what they do. And so recognizing as you grow and as you accomplish things, the fact that you're doing that not just because you're a seed or a tree, but because you're getting the nutritions and all these things from other people, the energy, I think it's a hugely important aspect of succeeding.
Yeah, that's really an inspiring answer. So that actually draws me to my next question. If you go back to your school life, to give us some advice. So what do you think, like during our PhD, what should we practice more or what should we avoid doing? I think one of the suggestions you just give us is just get the nutrients from the people around us. What else?
Yeah, that's a great follow-on question. Get the nutrients, recognize where they came from. Be gracious to people who do things for you. Don't hesitate to express that gratitude and be considerate of them for it. And then I would say in your career development, I mean, so much of what you can succeed at is going to be driven by your willingness to persevere. I could tell my life story with nothing but a whole lot of highlights of success, and I'm going to sound like a guy who just wants to do something and it happens, and that's so not the case. And it's why I told you the part I did about failing out of school as a first undergrad experience for me, because those are important, right? I mean, you really very rarely will you find success without a considerable amount of failure, and being willing to embrace that. Not that it's going to make you happy. No one likes failing, but not to allow it to derail your motivation to truly achieve what you are ultimately interested in accomplishing is a really important characteristic to hold on to.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's very valuable. I think let's have a look if there are some questions from the audience. So it seems like nobody is typing the questions. So if that's the case, let's just close the session. Thank you so much, Professor, for sharing your experience with us and encourage us to do our life. And I think one of the biggest lessons I learned from this talk is always follow our heart and do the thing we feel like doing. And that might ends up to be some opportunity. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Joy. Thank you, the rest of the organizers. It's been a real treat to spend some time reminiscing with you.
Thank you. Have a nice weekend.
You too.
Bye.